Hosea now moves to a second monument, a lone donkey, in verse 9. For they have gone up to Assyria like a wild donkey wandering alone. A lone domesticated donkey would be protected by his owner. Group of wild donkeys could fight off most any enemy. But a lone wild donkey in the wilderness was as vulnerable as you can get. And Hosea wanted Israel to imagine this donkey all by itself, with no one to protect it, being attacked perhaps by a mountain lion or some other wild creature, being ripped apart. And he said, this is us without God's protection. This is us when we step beyond the perimeter of God's love and his grace. Israel had abandoned God's lordship to live on the wild side, not understanding what it meant to live on the wild side. You see, calling ourselves God's people doesn't necessarily mean that we live with God. Each one of us has to question whether or not we live within the parameters of God's will. Maybe this morning you are at odds with God. You're butting heads with his will. God obviously wants to do something in your life, but you don't want to do that. You have something else in mind. Or maybe it's that you are knowingly, intentionally living in violation of God's guidelines. You understand what the Bible says, but you're not sure this applies to you. Or you think that it's there, but God's grace is going to cover it, so even if you fail, you're going to be okay. Could be as simple as harboring unchristlike qualities or attitudes in your heart. Anything from pride to resentment of others. You see, being outside the perimeters of God's protection isn't a safe place to be. And Hosea said, we have made ourselves vulnerable, not because God has abandoned us, but because we have abandoned God. Millions of men and women have given their lives for us to have freedom. Let's not squander that freedom. Let's use it. Remembering that ultimate freedom is religious freedom. The right to follow, serve, and to love God. The third monument that Hosea portrays is perhaps a coin. For us, it might be a flashing blue light or red light. It's the prostitute's fee. The second part of verse 9, Ephraim has sold herself to lovers. Although they have sold themselves among the nations, I will now gather them together. They will begin to waste away under the oppression of the mighty king. Can you imagine going to town, enlisting the services of a prostitute, and a year later sitting in the court of that prostitute, and the prostitute being your judge? The tables have turned for Israel. They're going to pay a tremendous price. You know, as I thought about this particular verse, it dawned on me, I have never preached a sermon on prostitution. How many of you know of a church that has a prostitution problem? It's not really an issue for us, is it? What about the double standards of sexual behavior? Is that a problem? You bet it is. Even within the church, we still believe that God has a different set of standards for men than He does women. We will congratulate men who come of age and prove their manhood, but we will call the woman a slut. Now that's a problem. And what about these teenagers? According to one statistic, at least 50% of our teenagers are sexually active. The schools haven't failed. You and I have failed. The church has failed. We have failed to teach the sanctity of life and sexuality and marriage. And Israel had failed. Hosea said, we have sold ourselves to lovers. We choose whether or not to be faithful to God in the same way that we choose whether or not we're going to be moral or immoral. What would you do if your spouse or your boyfriend or your girlfriend or your fiancé was unfaithful? God let Israel go. He said, I'm going to let you have what you want. But you think it's been tough, me being Lord? Just wait until you serve under someone else as Lord. If you travel down the streets of Chattanooga, you can see all kinds of places that have been converted from shops to churches, houses of worship. Hosea saw just the opposite. He saw what used to be sacred places of worship to God now being desecrated, being used for other purposes. Verse 11, though Ephraim built many altars for sin offerings, these have become altars for sinning. I wrote for them the many things of my law, but they regarded them as something alien. They offer sacrifices given to me, and they eat the meat, but the Lord is not pleased with them. He said they have church buildings. They go to church. They read the Bible, but they don't apply it. They go through the motions, but they're not truly religious people. If any nation chooses to live outside the perimeter of God's protection, if any individual makes that same choice, that nation and individual will fall into the tragic cycle of sin. The destruction continues. Now God will remember their wickedness and punish their sins. They will return to Egypt. Israel has forgotten his maker and built palaces. Judah has fortified many towns, but I will send fire upon their cities and will consume their fortresses. We are in a race. The race is not to disarm another nation or to outarm another nation. The race is to serve God. And God calls for us to focus on ourselves as a nation. Are we as a nation running to win? Are we as a nation following God's rules? Are we as a nation following the pattern of those who aren't running to win? Do we want to be like the rest of the world? Do we want to not give our best? God creates every person and God creates every nation for a purpose.